Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Known as the Canonical Five, these women were all victims of the infamous serial killer Jack the Ripper. The murders took place between August and November 1888, and due to heavy media coverage and the identity of the killer unknown still to this day, Jack the Ripper has become immortalised in history as one of London's greatest mysteries. However, Jack the Ripper isn't the focus of today's story, as 50 years prior to the grisly events of 1888, reports of a very different Jack appeared. Initially terrorising women in Victorian London, reports and stories would eventually be told across the whole of England and even parts of Scotland. Stories that allegedly brought a retired Arthur Wellesley, more famously known as the first Duke of Wellington, out of retirement in a bid to capture him. Today we look at the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack. Mary Stevens, having visited her parents in Battersea, London, was making the short 1-mile journey to Lavender Hill, where she worked as a servant girl. It was whilst walking through Clapham Common that Mary was unexpectedly and violently grabbed by a figure who had leapt out from an alleyway. Unable to escape his vice-like grip, Mary was assaulted by her unknown assailant, who began kissing her face and ripping at her clothes to touch her body, with what Mary described as claw-like hands, quote, as cold and clammy as those of a corpse. Eventually, Mary was able to let out a scream for help, and her attacker fled immediately as passers-by and residents came to her aid. Despite searching the area, Mary's attacker could not be found, and he had seemingly vanished without a trace. The next day, a coachman reported that a man similarly had leapt out in front of his carriage, causing him to lose control and crash, injuring himself severely in the process. Witnesses claim that the unknown man then vaulted effortlessly over a 9-foot wall and disappeared, much like Mary Stevens' attacker. Following these sightings, press coverage and reports of similar attacks, word of the mysterious figure quickly spread, and eventually he was dubbed the name Spring-Heeled Jack, owing to his apparent ability to leap great heights to evade capture. And in January 1838, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cohen, officially recognised Spring-Heeled Jack's existence, ordering regular police searches and rewards for anyone who could apprehend and identify the unknown villain. On the night of February 20th, 1838, at around 8:45 p.m, an 18-year-old woman by the name of Jane Alsop recalled hearing a loud ringing of a bell at the gate to their home in Bearbine Lane. Upon opening the door to satisfy her curiosity and inform those responsible to cease ringing at such an hour, Jane was greeted by a cloaked gentleman claiming to be a police officer. "For God's sake, bring me a light, for we have caught Spring-Heeled Jack here in the lane," the officer informed her. Such was the officer's urgency, Jane grabbed a candle and immediately handed it to the officer. The officer then held the candle to his chest and threw off his cloak, to reveal what newspapers at the time quoted as a most hideous and frightful appearance. Jane described her attacker's eyes as resembling red balls of fire, and he allegedly vomited blue and white flames from his mouth. Much like Mary Stevens' encounter, the man then attacked Jane, ripping at her clothes and bare skin with what Jane described as claws that she was certain were of some metallic substance. Jane eventually struggled free and was able to flee her attacker, but he pursued, eventually catching her on the steps leading to her door, where he continued to tear at her arms and neck and ripped clumps of hair from her head. Having heard Jane's screams, her younger sister Mary, having witnessed the attack, was frozen in fear and unable to assist. However, their older sister intervened and was able to drag Jane back into the door and back to safety. Jane's attacker, however, was not finished, and he remained outside banging on the door, before the girl's screams for the police from an upper window scared him off and into the night. One week later, at around 8:30 p.m, on February the 27th, 1838, 18-year-old Lucy Scales was returning home from her brother's residence in Narrow Street, Limehouse, in London. Lucy was accompanied by her sister, who was reportedly walking some distance behind Lucy as they passed along Green Dragon Alley. It was here that they came across a tall, thin gentleman in a cloak. Upon seeing Lucy, without warning and unprovoked, the man spurted blue flames into Lucy's face, the shock of which caused her to collapse in a violent seizure that reportedly lasted for hours. Unlike Jane Alsop's attacker, the man did not lay a finger on the girls and instead casually walked away from the scene before Lucy's brother arrived, having heard his sister's screams for help. The incident took place approximately 2 miles from Jane Alsop's home, and both encounters, having been reported to a Mr. Hardwick of Lambeth Street Police Station, were deemed to be connected and had likely been carried out by the same person. In the months and years that followed the initial incidents, stories of Spring Hill Jack appeared in newspapers across England. Many reports were of imposters or well-known criminals who had been dubbed the name. Others were believed to be genuine sightings of the demon himself. In popular culture, Spring Hill Jack was a regular feature in the Penny Dreadfuls, where other such stories as the demon Barbara of Fleet Street originated. And plays were written and performed about him, where his character was depicted as anything from a demonic menace to a romantic vigilante. Children were also told stories to ensure they behaved, lest they become victims of the bogeyman they called Spring Hill Jack. Whilst no one man was ever captured that would be considered to be the real Spring Hill Jack, several theories as to the identity of the villain have arisen. Known for his often drunken, antisocial antics, Henry Beresford, also known as the third Marquis of Waterford, has been linked to the early stories of Spring Hill Jack under the belief that Henry, who had a history of issues with both women and the police, had concocted the character as a form of revenge. Given his status and connections, it's believed that Henry could have easily had produced a set of spring-loaded boots that would enable him to leap the great heights as described in the many accounts. Henry was also allegedly in the area of London where the first attacks took place around the time of their occurrence, and as a result, some believe this offers further evidence to consider Henry the most likely culprit. In March 1838, 2 men were questioned for the attack on Jane Alsop. They were named in local newspapers at the time simply as Mr. Milbank, a local carpenter, and Mr. Payne, a master bricklayer. On the night in question, Milbank, who had been shooting that day, was drinking with Payne at the White Hart pub, a short distance from Jane Alsop's home. The landlord of the White Hart, a Mr. Nicholson, stated that Milbank had gotten so drunk that he couldn't even carry his gun home, and had left the White Hart a while before 9 p.m. Dressed as the girls had described, in a white shooting jacket and white hat, Milbank made his way to the Morgan's Arms pub, a short walk away. Witnesses at the time placed Milbank at the scene, and comments he made upon arriving at the Morgan's Arms, where he allegedly stated, "What do you think of Spring-Heeled Jack now?" whilst clutching the remains of a candle, believed to have been handed to him by Jane Alsop, appeared to conclude that Milbank was the culprit. However, Milbank insisted he was so drunk that he had no recollection of any of the events from that night, a claim backed up by the landlord of the White Hart, and both Jane and her older sister insisted her attacker was not drunk at all. Both sisters also insisted that their claim that Jane's attacker could breathe fire and had red fireball eyes was true, and as a result, Milbank was eventually released due to an apparent lack of evidence. Early reports of Spring-Heeled Jack have him appearing in many guises, such as a large white bull, a white bear, and some even claimed he appeared as a baboon. Other early accounts have him clad in brass or steel armour with large metal claws, as described by Mary Stevens and Jane Alsop. It's for this reason that many believe Spring-Heeled Jack to be a supernatural creature, likening him to a shape-shifting demon somehow summoned to our world, and even an extraterrestrial being. And with many cryptids and spectres reported to be wandering the streets of London in the early 1800s, some believe them to be the many forms of Spring-Heeled Jack. However, some paranormal writers and skeptics alike believe that these individual stories and hauntings were often unrelated, and instead were attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack by the press, thus condensing the stories of many supernatural occurrences into one neat and sensational package. The last official sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack occurring in 1904 in both Liverpool and Dover, his identity will forever remain a mystery. But with similar tales of leaping demons such as Perak, the Spring Man of Prague in the 1940s, and the Monkey Man of Delhi in 2001, could it be that Spring-Heeled Jack is not only very real, but in fact left England in the early 1900s and has been terrorising innocent people across the globe ever since?